All right. Thanks everyone. Thanks for, the opportunity to talk to you all. I'm enjoying seeing sort of the sides of everyone's faces. Um, and hopefully at some point I'll see the front of your faces at various conferences. Um, so, um, Given my understanding of this series focused on methods, today I wanted to present my background as a sort of interlocking history between the development of the lab's theory of working memory and the development of our methods to test this theory. In the majority of cases, this is us sort of stealing methods that have already been developed, like from fMRI. But in the main project I'm going to be talking about for sort of the back half of the talk, we're also sort of doing our own tooling, sort of cobbling together a new method from parts to help us answer our specific questions. Um, and then lastly, I kind of want to flag that this might be a little bit repetitive with some of the talk that Edo gave a couple weeks ago. I'm hoping that when we're touching upon the same projects, we're kind of giving different perspectives. I'm maybe giving more of a methods focus that maybe like enriches your understanding of the work. That would be ideal, and hopefully it's not too repetitive. I didn't see his talk at all, so who knows? Um, all right, so getting started, I know that y'all are pretty familiar with working memory in this department, so I'm just going to give sort of my brief definition to kind of get us on the same page. So most researchers think of working memory as an active, capacity-limited storage system. It's where we hold pertinent information for rapid access and manipulation, like colored squares in many of our tasks. And in theory, it's our ability to manipulate that information that underlies decision making and flexible behavior. And one's ability to effectively store information in working memory is associated with a bunch of positive life outcomes. So it's critical to understand both understand how to build, useful interventions to help people achieve positive life outcomes and things like that. And while there are a lot of theories that provide good fits to behavior in terms of explaining what's going on with working memory, I'm coming from a cogneural perspective where we want to leverage neural signals to help us develop and distinguish between plausible and implausible theories. Um, Now, one big class of neural signals of working memory that I'm only going to briefly touch upon right now are those that track the specific stimulus information that is being held in working memory. So this was sort of originally first seen in spiking studies with monkeys, where you could find individual cells that had preferences for certain information, and they would continue to fire over the course of the delay period, like this cell that codes for bottom location. It's also been seen in fMRI decoding studies with different features being coded for and maintained in different regions of the cortex, depending on the task and the goals and what features are available. And these sorts of results have given rise to neurally plausible theories of working memory, like the sensory recruitment hypothesis, which suggests that information is maintained in working memory in the same regions that originally processed it. And it's also given rise to other theories that argue that the capacity limits that we see in working memory are driven by like neural noise increasing or increasing interference between stimulus representations within these sensory regions that are now maintaining the stimuli. Um, Today, I'm mostly going to focus on a complementary class of signals that we're treating as key data for understanding working memory. And those are signals that appear to track the amount of things in working memory, which I'm going to call load. Um, Ed Vogel really discovered the most commonly studied load signal, which is the contralateral delay activity. This is a posterior negativity recorded that you get from EEG data. It's a posterior negativity that is contralateral to the attended items that we're asking people to remember. The nice thing about it is that it scales with memory set size, or the amount of stuff we're asking you to remember, up until behavioral capacity limits around 3 or 4. And it doesn't seem to meaningfully discriminate between the specific visual features that are being maintained. So in this example from Woodman and Vogel, they found that the CDA increase when going from 2 to 4 colors was similar as when you went from 2 to 4 orientations and colored orientations, even though in that last case, you're sort of doubling the amount of feature information that you have to maintain. Other groups have found similar signals in fMRI, like Todd and Marwa and Xu and Chun, that also seem to scale up until behavioral capacity limits. And these sorts of signals are more aligned with slot-like or object file theories, which suggest that working memory is operating at the level of like these abstract objects rather than being constrained at the feature level. But one thing about all of these works is that they're using univariate measures of brain activity, which can make it difficult to compare different conditions because they're flattening everything onto a single axis. So it might sort of over-amplify the similarity or differences that's more obvious when you move into a multidimensional space. So my primary toolkit during my PhD has been multivariate analyses. I mostly use classifiers, but I'm also going to talk about representational similarity analysis, a little bit of Bayesian modeling as we get later into the talk. We've also used inverted encoding models, which I know is super familiar to like Julie Golem's work, but I won't really be talking about that here. I just wanted to highlight that this multivariate analysis is nice for a few reasons. One, just for working memory, we get away from lateralized designs where we have to cue people to one side or the other side of the screen. Instead, they can just kind of encode everything in a more naturalistic way. It's more sensitive than univariate measures, like we can get away with less data while still establishing reliable effects. And then most importantly, by being able to train a classifier in one context and test it in another, it's giving us a sort of explicit test of whether or not a signal is consistent and sort of parallel or orthogonal or sort of something in between when we look across context. So in our lab, Will Thayer was the first to sort of use this explicit test via generalization. He ran what was essentially a replication to that Woodman and Vogel study I talked about with the having participants view colors, orientations, or the conjunction of colored orientations. And then he took a decoding approach where, at each time point from our EEG data, he trained a classifier. So just with like a toy example with two electrodes, we would train a classifier to decode set size, the number of colors that people needed to remember. And so once we have our classifier trained, we would just test whether it generalized to one of the held out other features like orientation or the conjunction condition, and use that as our assess that of whether the working memory load signal was consistent across these different conditions. And so when he did that, he found that when you trained on colors and tested on orientations and vice versa, you saw very strong generalization of this load model, as well as when you trained on a single feature and tested on the conjunctions and vice versa. So this kind of provided a nice, multivariate example of a consistent load signal. However, we got this feedback at the time, colors and orientations are jointly encoded in the early visual cortex and sort of throughout the visual processing stream. And so it's really possible that we're actually are picking up on two sort of interleaved load signals, and that EEG is just too coarse to pick up the differences between these. And so what looks like one signal is really just two similar signals. So we ran some follow-up studies still using this decoding approach with more disparate features that should be represented in different parts of the brain. So we ran one follow-up with participants viewing these colored random dot kinematograms, where they would either remember the colors or the motion coherence level, which is like whether the motions were coherent or incoherent. Still a change detection task, so the motions would change from coherent to incoherent or vice versa, or they would change in color. And we chose motion because it's processed much later in the visual pathway, starting around area MT or MST. So if we were picking up on region-specific load signals, these should be quite different, and even EEG should be able to detect the differences. So we fit a classifier for every combination of training and testing features, and we found that when we trained on the remember color data, it basically perfectly generalized to the remember motion data. On the flip side, when we trained on motion and tested on motion, we sort of saw this boost in decodability, which we think is driven by the presence of motion-specific signals. But we still see this really robust generalization to the remember color data. And we see all this despite the fact that we can really strongly decode which feature participants were attending to. So it's not that they were just grabbing everything on every trial and producing the same sort of representations. It seems like they are grabbing the relevant information. And despite that, we're getting consistent load signals. one more study in this vein, an undergrad in the lab took it even further by asking whether or not we could um, find a general load signal across sensory modalities. So he ran a sequential change detection task where participants saw colors or sounds and then trained and tested a load model. And he found again that when you trained on one modality, tested on the other, we saw a very strong generalization, as well as when you trained on single feature and tested on conjunction. So using this decoding approach, we found that our load models generalized across differences in type and quantity of features being held in memory, whether that was colors and orientations or motions or sounds. And so with this sort of, testing framework, we were able to argue that we think that the load signal is picking up on some item-based attentional control process. Now, this isn't the only possible interpretation for this seemingly content-independent signal. An alternative is spatial attention, which I'm going to briefly talk about, and I'm going to talk about how we kind of upgraded from decoding to representational similarity analysis to help sort of rule out the possibility of spatial attention explaining these results. So the general spatial attention account is that when we have our participants remembering these different set sizes, what we've perceived as some load signal scaling with the items in working memory is actually a signal reflecting the breadth or allocation of spatial attention as it spreads out at higher set sizes. There has been previous work that has found some initial evidence for dissociations between signals that seem to track working memory load and signals that seem to track spatial attention, but they often are still confounding the number of targets and the number of locations, and they use univariate measures that make it difficult to track both spatial attention and working memory load simultaneously. So we ran a project where we wanted to be able to apply multivariate approaches while independently manipulating both of these factors. So we used this dot cloud change detection paradigm where participants would see these sets of colored dots that were like the identity of the cloud was defined by the color. And they would see either one or two dot clouds. And then after delay, they were tested on whether one of them changed in location or shape. In this case, this blue cloud has changed in location. And because we were using these dot clouds where they could change in size and they could overlap in space, we could independently manipulate these two factors. And then once we had our data, we did start with classification and inverted encoding models to sort of look at, working memory load and spatial attention in sort of some more standard ways. And we did find evidence that the two signals were quite independent, but we also found evidence for at least one more signal that seemed to be present in the data and was sort of muddying our interpretations. And that was that there seemed to be an extra signal when the clouds were overlapping versus when they weren't overlapping. And so what we wanted was some way of sort of extracting that signal separately and sort of seeing if our other signals survived or were clearer. So to do that, we ran representational similarity analysis, and this was our first time using it, but now we've kind of used it on every subsequent project just about. And I'll sort of talk about the benefits we get out of it at the end of this. But first, I'll just walk through how we typically use it in our lab. And when I say our lab, I mean the Ed's lab. I'm just a kid who works there. But getting back to our toy illustration of the different conditions here, rather than trying to train on a subset of conditions and generalize to others, you just compute the decodability between every pair of conditions. The set of dissimilarities between all of these conditions is often represented as one of these representational dissimilarity matrix, where we have our 9 different conditions for all of our different combinations of set size and size of the clouds and whether or not they overlapped. And in these matrices, each cell reflects the dissimilarity between a pair of conditions, like in this case, a set size 1, just a single narrow cloud versus 2 narrow clouds that are perfectly overlapping. And then once we have our empirical dissimilarities, we ask whether they can be explained by some factors that are also differing across our different conditions. So we create predicted dissimilarities. We have them for our 2 main factors of interest, which were set size and the total attended area. And we also have dissimilarities based on whether or not the clouds were overlapping. So just walking through the toy example of the set size, dissimilarity matrix, we predict that all of our set size 1 conditions look similar to each other, and all of our set size 2 conditions look similar to each other, and all of our set size 1 conditions look maximally dissimilar from our set size 2 conditions. We have a similar setup for whether or not the clouds are overlapping. And then for attended area, we just kind of assume an underlying signal that grows linearly with the relevant area, and then compute our expected dissimilarities based on that. And then once we have our predicted dissimilarities, we just fit a linear regression between the empirical and the theoretical dissimilarities. And then we do a little bit of extra work to get the semi-partial correlation for each of these factors with the empirical dissimilarities. And they take this as a measure of the individual contribution of these factors or of each factor to the empirical results. I know it's a little hard to ask questions in this setup. If anyone has questions and they can be relayed to me at any point, that would be great. Otherwise, I'm just going to kind of plow through and take questions at the end. But I hope this is clear so far and hopefully not boringly clear. So once we have those semi-partial correlations, we can do this process at every time point in our trial by computing the empirical dissimilarities at each time point and then fitting our models. And now I'll just plot the results. So we did in fact see that there was some signal reflecting whether or not the clouds were overlapping, which explains sort of the messiness of some of the other results in the data set. We also saw evidence for a signal that was scaling with the total relevant area, though it waned pretty quickly across the trial. And we've actually sort of seen the shape multiple times since. But lastly, even though we're now controlling for these other factors, we still saw evidence for the set size signal that was present and sustained across the delay period. And so, with this set of results and the other results in the paper, we think it's pretty clear that this item-based control process is distinct from a spatially based control process. It's not to say that spatial attention isn't important and maybe even a prerequisite to later item-based control, but it does seem like they are dissociable. And then I'll just sum up with our thoughts on RSA is that this was a really nice example where it turned out that we weren't able to control for everything exactly as we wanted. Like you can't possibly control for every confound every time, but sometimes it's easy to separately manipulate those other factors. And then using something like RSA, you can sort of model them all simultaneously and sort of still extract the presence or absence of your signals of interest. So we've been using it a lot, but that's what I'll say for now. So with this set of results, this fact that we have this content-independent load signal that is not explained by spatial attention, the lab really wanted to understand what this load signal reflects. And so to answer that question, they've been developing a theory that's building on Zenon Polishin's work, along with Daniel Kahneman and others. It kind of is building off of two key ideas. One is that selecting items to store in working memory probably shares mechanisms with selecting items to pay attention to during normal everyday events. And two, everyday items are visually dynamic and they require a flexible system to keep track of each item, even as the below level features may change. So, for example, we can keep track of this ball even as it's changing in color and location, while still recognizing it as the same ball. To sort of solve this dynamic problem, Polishin proposed that our visual cognition relies on an abstract indexing operation that links our representation of the ball to its trajectory across space and time. And then we can use that link to update low-level features of the ball, like its color, without breaking a sense of identity. So, sorry if you could hear the train that just went by. If we think about our working memory trials as dynamic events across time, what we're proposing is that as items are encoded into working memory, they are assigned this index that is linking their content to their location in space and time. And that through this linking index, these items are bound to the current trial, enabling selective access and our ability to make judgments about the content later in the trial. We've been calling these indices pointers, and we're proposing that it's the allocation of pointers that the load signals are tracking rather than the specific content being maintained. Now, there are a few different implications of the pointer theory. But for the main project I'm going to be talking about here for the rest of the talk, I'm just going to focus on one. Now, the idea is that capacity limits in working memory are due to us only having a limited number of pointers that we can allocate, and that individual differences may be driven by differences in our ability to allocate them. This leads to the prediction that working memory load signals should plateau at behavioral capacity limits and that they should reflect individual differences. This has been shown before, particularly in work by Kei Fukuda, who found that the CDA did in fact peak at around 3 items. And importantly, it plateaued for high capacity subjects, but for low capacity subjects, subjects who performed worse on working memory overall, it waned over the course of increasing set sizes. And this actually mirrored the behavioral performance that they saw as well. And so it does suggest that higher capacity subjects are, efficient at pointer allocation, and they remain efficient even when they're overloaded, while low capacity subjects become less efficient. That said, this work was again a univariate approach, and it didn't control for differences in spatial attention that vary across set size, and that may have bled into the CDA. And so what we wanted was to design a new data set that would let us look across set sizes while controlling for spatial attention and sort of like replicate this in a multivariate space. So I've collected one data set. I'm currently collecting a second data set that I'll talk about at the end, where we had participants complete a change detection task with 2, 4, 6, or 8 as the set size. We also varied whether or not there were these placeholders to match the total number of items on every trial. So on 50% of trials, participants would just see the things to remember. And then on 50% of trials, participants would get additional these like light donuts such that there were a total of 10 things on the screen. The reason we added this manipulation is that in most of our decoding work, we always have these quote unquote placeholders to sort of match the total number of things on the screen. And while this is good because it matches sensory energy and sort of bottom up differences in light and everything, it does potentially place a filtering demand, and that additional signal could, also appear in our load signal, particularly since multivariate, decoders just kind of take whatever signals they can find. So we use this as our setup, and then we had a change detection task, and then in terms of dealing with spatial attention, we couldn't really think of a way to control for spatial attention between 2 items and 8 items. And so we instead opted for a way to try to independently estimate spatial attention and how it varies. And so on some blocks, participants had to remember the colors in a normal change detection task, but in others, they just had to use the colors as relevant location markers that they were supposed to attend to while they waited for rare digits to appear. And on 90% of trials, nothing happened, and they just attended to the locations. And then on 10% of the trials, 2 digits would appear, and they had to judge the odd evenness of the digit that appeared at an attended location. So in this case, this 9 appeared at the purple location. So when the final probe appears, they would respond odd. I hope that's clear. It maybe sounds like a bit of a weird task, but we actually ran something similar before in the lab. Nicole Hakim ran a version of this, like 4 different studies, and found that it did a very good job of isolating changes in spatial attention without having participants actually remember the colored squares. And so it seems like a good way of estimating how spatial attention changes. With that setup, the first thing we did was sort of our vanilla decoding analysis. So we trained a classifier to decode set size 4 versus set size 2 in our normal working memory task with placeholders as our sort of baseline comparison. And now here I'm plotting not the sort of decodability, but the distance from the classifier's decision boundary across time, with positive being predicting set size 4, negative being predicting set size 2. And hopefully what you can see is that the classifier, reliably separates these 2 conditions. So it works. That's just sort of replicating stuff we've seen over and over again. But once we have the setup, we can then ask, what predictions does it make about the held out conditions? So first, averaging over the delay period, here are the predictions for set sizes 2, 4, and 6, and 8 of our standard working memory task with placeholders. you can see that it makes pretty orderly predictions. It kind of predicts 6 and 8 as like super set size 4, although this is only trending towards significant. Um, but maybe what you'll notice is that this is sort of more of a like monotonically increasing function. If it's plateauing, it's maybe plateauing around set size 6, which is later than what we've seen in the past and definitely much later than behavioral limits. But I'll talk about why that might be in a second. Um, so the next thing that we can do is sort of take the difference or the contrast between our set size 4 and set size 2 predictions as our measure of decodability. This is actually what we've used in most of the work that I presented so far. And I can talk about why that's a nice measure, in the questions. But we can use that as a measure of decodability, and then we can compute that measure for all of our different combinations of the working memory task with and without placeholders and the spatial attention task with and without placeholders. And so here I'm going to plot those decodability results. We see in the warm colors our working memory tasks with and without placeholders are basically right on top of each other, while our spatial attention tasks are in cool colors. They're down here, sort of just getting by. If we average across the delay period, the spatial attention results are significantly above chance, but they're also significantly less than our working memory decodability. So it seems like there's a big hit and not strong generalization. There is a trend towards there being a difference of the placeholders presence or absence, but it's quite small. I think it's like p equals 0.06, and I forget the effect size is quite small. And one result that I'll just say that I don't have a figure for is that if you instead train on the situation without placeholders, the sensory energy confound is so large that it really swamps everything and the generalization is very bad. So relative to that, this is a much stronger sort of between condition generalization. Now, as I mentioned, the spatial attention signals were still significantly above chance. And so one possibility is that participants, do have a little bit of working memory leakage where they are still grabbing some of the items. But an alternative is that there is still a spatial attention signal, varying and present in our working memory task. And so when we train a classifier on our working memory data, it's picking up both on working memory load signals and spatial attention signals. And then when we test it on the spatial attention data, we're just getting the spatial attention part of it. So to test that hypothesis, we ran another decoding analysis where we trained on the spatial attention conditions, and then tested on our 4 different options. And here we see that all of them drop down to this sort of middling strength. And when we look at the average delay period, here we see no difference between the 2 conditions. We do see now a significant difference between the placeholder present and placeholder absent differences. And so it went from like p equals 0.06 to p equals 0.03. And so it's possible that the placeholder makes a slightly bigger impact for the spatial attention signal than it does for the working memory signal. And that would make sense. But if we sort of summarized over the results of our decoding analyses via comparison, it seems like the placeholder effect is relatively small, particularly in comparison to the sensory energy results, which I'm sorry, I don't have a nice figure for. And so you kind of have to trust me on that one. But it seems like it might be pretty easy to filter all the placeholders. They all looked the same. They're all the same color. It might have produced sort of a texture that is easy to ignore. But for the spatial attention task, it's possible that it forced the presence of placeholders actually forces the use of top-down spatial attention versus without placeholders, you can just kind of pay attention to everywhere that an object was. So that could explain that modulation there. But lastly, and kind of most importantly, it seems like our working memory model and our working memory conditions actually contain a mixture of both working memory signals and spatial attention signals. And so that can explain why we didn't get the normal plateau or decrease in our working memory model before. And it brings us to using RSA because we want to lean on that earlier logic that we can use this to sort of simultaneously estimate all of our signals of interest rather than trying to control everything away, because it seems like we can't really control for spatial attention, but we can maybe estimate it away. Now, there is a limitation to our old approach, which is that you need a well-defined set of predictions for how your signals of interest should change across the different levels of the factor. So if we're taking, for example, how our working memory load signal changes across our different set sizes, we need a concrete prediction. So, you know, a very simple prediction or assumption would be that it just linearly increases with set size. But we know from CDA data and fMRI data and behavioral performance that it doesn't seem to increase like this. It seems to, if anything, saturate and reach a plateau. But it might do something different. It might behave totally differently in this multivariate space. Maybe it behaves in one paradigm up until capacity limits, and then a different paradigm and supercapacity limits. And the problem is that without knowing, what is a strong model, each produces different dissimilarity matrices that can provide, better or worse fits to the data. Now, one possible solution would be to figure out every single possible shape of function here and then iteratively fit and find the one of best fit. But if you're trying to do that for every signal of interest simultaneously, the computation explodes, as does the fear of overfitting. And so to get around that, we went with a Bayesian modeling approach where we wanted to provide minimal constraints on the shapes of these functions and then let it discover the appropriate shape that would produce the best fitting dissimilarities. So getting into the nitty gritty of this is sort of our new method that we're sort of tooling together here. And it comes with sort of the following assumptions. The first is that the dissimilarities that we've, sort of observed empirically come from some normal distribution with some amount of, noise, but that normal distribution is centered on a linear combination of the other dissimilarities of our signals of interest. So we have one signal of interest, which is sensory energy. That's just sort of the amount of stuff on the screen. It's sort of also the inverse of whether or not you need filtering. So they're just kind of conflated here. And we just baked in the general assumption that sensory energy just scales monotonically with the number of items on the screen. We made a similar assumption, for sensory energy, we made a similar assumption for spatial attention, that it would just also sort of scale monotonically on the screen, though it might plateau or it might exponentially increase. But it has a pretty flexible shape here. And then for our working memory function, we just gave it two very loose constraints. The first is that the working memory load signal at a given set size would be related to its load at the preceding set size. So it's kind of making a random walk. This is mostly just constraining a little bit of autocorrelation across set sizes so that the load function isn't just noisily pinging up and down and up and down. But you can sort of loosen that by increasing the width, the sigma of the steps. And then the other constraint is that working memory load at set size 2 in the working memory task is higher than the average of the spatial attention tasks, which are all just sort of treated as 1, and they're all sort of treated as the baseline load 0 condition. This is half because we think it's reasonable based on the decoding analyses and Nicole Hakim's original results, and half because you just need to constrain the shape of the function. Otherwise, it will produce, a mirror image where instead of everything going positive at the start, the first step goes negative, and you just get a mirror. Those sort of functions produce the same set of dissimilarities, and so you just kind of need to constrain the first step to be positive or negative. So, positive makes sense based on other work, so we locked that in. Okay, so we set that up, we fit to the data, and now I can show you the posterior functions across our different factor levels. So for sensory energy, we saw that it did, our posterior function suggests that it is in fact just increasing kind of more or less linearly. I wasn't sure if there was going to be kind of a strange change when going from 8 to 10, because that's 10 is when we introduce all of the placeholders across our different set sizes, but it seems like it's, just kind of same as anything else, which is nice. Um, for spatial attention, it's broken down by the number of relevant locations, which is always a minimum of two. So that's sort of our baseline here. Same with the number of stimuli in the display. And here we see that the spatial attention signal really seems to plateau. Maybe it's slightly increasing around 6 and 8, but really it's plateauing around 4. And this contrasts with our working memory load function, which now instead of increasing, um, from 2 to 4 to 6 to 8 is peaking around 2 and really plateauing or even decreasing a little bit. And so now, we can use the average of these posterior distributions to produce some expected dissimilarity matrices. And so hopefully you can see how these sum up together to produce our empirical dissimilarity matrix. I thought this was cool. I hope you guys think that this is cool. Maybe it's just pretty figures to me. But we think this is, kind of supporting that this method is doing a good job of recovering reasonable functions that can reasonably predict our empirical dissimilarities. Now, the last part of this method is that when we fit the model, we actually don't fit it to just the average dissimilarities, which you can do, but we actually fit it to all of the individually estimated dissimilarity matrices at once. And so once we have that, we can get a posterior distribution for each individual, and we can break it into high capacity and low capacity. And when we do that for our working memory load function, we get these qualitatively different shapes. So for high capacity subjects, the posterior load function plateaus really nicely. But for low capacity subjects, it peaks around 2 items and then actually begins to decrease. And so this again suggests that low capacity subjects maybe become less efficient at pointer allocation when they're overloaded. And so overall, this sort of plot and this work is consistent with the claim that the load signal is reflecting pointer allocation, and pointer allocation is mediating individual differences in working memory performance. Now, there are a couple of surprising things here that I want to hit on and sort of set up the follow-up data set as we get to the end of this. Our first is that we're seeing this peak at set size 2, while most work finds it, around set size 3 or even set size 4. Obviously, we don't have set size 3 here, and so we can't know whether it would have peaked higher here and then gone down. But in behavioral estimates of capacity with like big N data sets, the average capacity is around 2 2/3 of an item. And so it makes sense that the peak would be closer to 2 than to 4. The next thing is that we weren't able to model a task set signal. We have participants doing 2 pretty different tasks, and you have to keep these tasks in mind, for trials and trials at a time. And this is probably going to produce a meaningfully different signal. We've been able to decode task sets or like which task you're doing a lot in previous work, but we unfortunately can't do it here because it actually produces a set of predictions that look almost identical to the plateau result here. So it would just treat all of the spatial attention tasks as one value, and it would treat all of the working memory tasks as another value, and then just set those as different. And if I went back to the expected dissimilarity matrix here, if you sort of washed out these sort of variations here, and I'm not sure if you can see, there's sort of like a subtle little difference of patterns here. But if you kind of ignore those subtle differences, it really kind of just looks like something that's differentiating between the 2 different tasks that participants were performing. And while that can't explain the qualitative difference in shape here, because it can only ever predict a plateau, it might be mixed in with the signal and sort of squashing meaningful differences in the shapes of the functions. And so we want to run a follow-up where we can include a task set signal separately. So we're now running a second experiment. We're dropping the placeholders because in general, it seems like the filtering demands are relatively small signals, and the sensory energy is much bigger, and we need to save space for more conditions. So we've added more set sizes. We got 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 8. And I bolded the 0 in red because set size 0 trials are always kind of controversial in working memory studies. It's hard to tell. How can you, know that people aren't remembering anything and they're not paying attention to anything? And this is where I reveal that we actually collected the first data set almost 2 years ago, and then we kind of set up all the results, and then we wanted to replicate it, and we kind of spun our wheels for a while on a set size 0. But here's what we've ultimately landed on. Another benefit of always having placeholders is that we can have only placeholder trials at the start, where participants are told you don't need to worry about remembering anything or paying attention to anywhere, and you just need to make a decision at test. And so we made, modified tests for our 2 different tasks. For the working memory task, now they always see 2 colored squares, and the question is just, are those colored squares the same or different? And then for the spatial attention task, sometimes they'll just get that lone colored square. They'll get a situation where no digits will appear, and they'll just get a colored square. And in other cases, when the digits do appear, that one is just boxed with a colored frame. And the question is, is that odd or even? And so participants, when we ask them, they sort of feel like it's the same task. We try to really describe it in the same way. In the first way, you're making the same different judgment. In the spatial attention task, you're making an odd even judgment for the digit at a colored location. And participants seem to buy that and seem to feel like they're doing the same task. Unfortunately, I only have 5 subjects so far, so I don't have data to support that we're doing it the right way yet, and we may collect more, and then once we take a peek, need to reconsider. So I just want to close with a little bit of behavior data. So if we look at the performance in the working memory task, unsurprisingly, people kind of get monotonically worse. And really part of the reason I bring this up is that whenever we try to present work about working memory load signals, we get at least one reviewer saying, well, how do you know it's not just effort? And what we've seen across sort of all of the data sets so far is that our accuracy functions don't predict the working memory load functions. We'll see differences between conditions that don't match the generalization of the load signal between those conditions. Or in this case, we see, and in both experiments, we saw accuracy kind of monotonically decreasing. But for this experiment, we also added an explicit effort slider where we asked participants to rate how much effort they felt like they were putting into the task. And they were sort of normalized, with 0 being no effort at all and 1 being max effort possible. And we see that people do feel like they are trying harder and harder. Obviously subjective ratings are hard to judge, but we're just hoping to add this as sort of another way of triangulating, effort. We have worked with some previous collaborators who think that they have found a neural signature of effort. So we want to hopefully map that onto these ratings and this performance and show that it's different from our working memory load signals. But that's future direction as well. Okay, so over the course of the talk, I hope I was able to provide a semi-coherent story of how our lab has expanded and developed its methods in order to continue developing its theory of working memory. For the FMI folks in the audience who are super familiar with decoding and RSA, I hope this wasn't too boring. I hope this was, still useful. And for everyone, I, just want to say, like, I'm not necessarily recommending these specific methods and that you should use them all the time and that they're the perfect hammers. But I thought it was helpful to keep track of what tools were out there and what problems they might solve. And then when I ran into those problems, it was nice to be able to incorporate them into my toolkit. And lastly, I just need to close by thanking my lab. I'm thanking the Vogel lab. I primarily work with Ed O, but Ed Vogel has been a great supporter as well. And if you're considering going to UChicago or going to Chicago, the beautiful city of Chicago for your next academic step, highly recommend the Vogel lab. Okay, thank you all. Thank you for listening to me straight for 45 minutes.
Any questions? Please go to the podium. Okay. Hey Henry, this is a cool talk. I just have a couple clarifications. I kind of assumed you use all channels for your decoding and analysis, but I was just wondering if you see any differences in terms of different channels for all of these working memory or attention decoding analyses you did.
Yeah, that's a great question. I normally just use all. Sometimes I'll drop FP1, FP2, like I'll do with and without, and just make sure that things are pretty stable. Previous work from our lab has sort of like looked at which clusters of electrodes kind of contribute, and we have a new paper out doing that for spatial attention. That was a collaboration with Damien Covet. And I would say that in general, it seems like spatial attention signals are unsurprisingly mostly posterior. Um, and the load signals kind of move quite quickly from posterior to more parietal frontal. And then we tend to see them being kind of stable. Um, but yeah, right now I do use everything. I am planning on doing some follow-up analyses where I do a little bit of spotlighting to see how the functions change if you take different regions. But in general, we use everything.
Great, thanks. Another question I have is that I noticed some of the load signals, they kind of take a little while to see changes in the load. And I'm just wondering what your take on is on that, if you kind of recommend specific methods that are better to be able to see that difference maybe early on during the delay versus later on.
Hmm. Sorry, I want to scroll back to get some examples. So you're maybe talking about like this or um, like here. Um, so
Mhm.
I think the load signals do take a little bit. They're normally pretty fast. Like they'll start within the first 200 milliseconds. What we've noticed is that they're pretty dynamic for the first 400 to 500 milliseconds, and then they sort of tend to become more stable. Like if you look at temporal generalization, um, and so that is something that we're still like kind of curious about and investigating is like what's the difference between that early phase and that late phase? Is it possible that there are still some confounding things that are kind of resolving quickly, like spatial attention, for example, really wanes very quickly. So if you're not carefully controlling for that, you can get something that's predominantly reflecting spatial attention and then something that's predominantly reflecting load later. Um, in general, like I guess we're lucky in that a lot of our questions don't care about timing. And so selfishly, I would suggest kind of focusing on the back half of a delay period where we know that the load signals are quite stable and relatively like um, un mixed with spatial tension. So it's a pretty pure signal. Um, if you were interested in looking at it earlier, then I think it kind of depends on your task design a little bit. How easy is it to parse the objects and things like that? That might impact the initial decoding or whether you do it sequentially and you're kind of going object by object. But now I'm really just kind of rambling.
Thanks. Yeah.
Hi Henry, cool talk. Um, I have one question. So as you just said that most of the studies that you reported were like basically not looking at anything over time. I
Mm.
was curious about your prediction. Let's say if you started with a load four and then in the middle you give a retro cue, ask them to drop two. Do you think the classifier is able to pick up that, or like does it is it temporally dynamic enough in terms of the load signal and as well as the method?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can give a little bit of data that kind of has touched on that. So one is that people have tried that with the CDA. My understanding is that with the CDA, it's it's very good at adding things. Like you can keep adding more and like the load signal will keep going up and up and up. Um, but if you ask people to drop things, it's not very good at that unless you're asking them to like drop whole hemifields. Like if I've told you to, encode both sides and then you drop something, you'll get a CDA that's reflecting the side that you haven't dropped. But if I'm telling you to drop subsets of items, it's not as good. Um, the load signal does seem to be different from the CDA when, it seems to rely on different signals and so I wouldn't necessarily expect it to have the exact same um, dynamics there. And one study I know in that William Thayer paper from 2022, one of the things that they did was reanalyze a data set with illusions of objects. And so this is not quite the same because people weren't cued to do this, but they would present these wrench heads that would form illusory bars. And what they saw is that they had a model that was set size 2 and set size 4, and then four wrench heads that made two illusory bars. And it essentially looks like set size 4, and then over the course of the trial drops down to looking like set size 2. And so this is a case where it seems to be showing the dynamic updating of representations from these four wrench heads to these two bars. And so I think it could handle dynamics pretty well. But yeah, we haven't really done too many super sequential, like adding, dropping manipulations yet.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question, by the way. Thanks everyone who is engaging with the work. Much appreciated.